So how much does it cost to have a gestational carrier or surrogate? Well, is there anything in life that's really free? Well, now that I think about it, you've got hugs, you have love, you have friends, smiles, sleep. That's free. But what about assisted reproductive technologies? Is there a such thing as a truly altruistic surrogacy arrangement? Well, the answer is yes. But what does that mean when it comes down to actual dollars and cents? Are there any other expenses? Well, let's talk about it. What's up? I'm Corlandos Scott, and I'm a surrogacy attorney based in Los Angeles. So my practice revolves around helping people have babies. I handle the legal side when you're going through surrogacy. And in this episode, we're going to talk about how much it costs to do that. We're going to look at the base compensation for a surrogate. We're going to look at additional compensation, and we're also going to look at as needed compensation. Let's get to it. Now, generally, how much it would cost to have a gestational carrier depends on a lot of factors, and they're typically divided into two main categories: compensated surrogacy or altruistic surrogacy. Now, in compensated surrogacy, there's two major cost categories, I guess you could say. There's the base compensation, and then there's all the other expenses with the benefits package. Now, when I say benefits package, I'm talking about the arrangement and all of the costs that are associated with the surrogacy process, including base pay. Now, in altruistic surrogacy, although you don't pay the gestational carrier a base compensation, there are still some costs involved. But let's talk about compensated surrogacy. Now, when you say base compensation, let me just get this straight. It doesn't really mean compensation like payment for a job. I mean, think about it. You're not really compensating or paying the gestational carrier. You're merely giving back or returning what she may have lost during the time that she'll be spending as a gestational carrier. You'll notice in contracts it says that the payments are for all of the pain, the suffering, the inconvenience of carrying your baby. So what factors into base compensation? Well, base compensation depends on the state. You'll find that surrogates in states like California, or I anticipate New York, as they just now allowed compensated surrogacy to restart, it will probably be higher because of the cost of living in those places. Whereas you may find surrogates in other states are less expensive when it comes to the base compensation for themselves. Base compensation is also going to depend on experience. Is she a first-time surrogate who's unproven in surrogacy, or is she a repeat surrogate who has proven success in being a surrogate? The experience relates to how many successful pregnancies she's had and whether she's been a gestational carrier before. These are things that give you a peace of mind, and with that peace of mind, there's a little bit of a premium. Let me give you a range that I've seen. I've seen gestational carriers with base compensation pays of $30,000 all the way up to $130,000 for surrogates who've had a number of successful surrogacy arrangements and were specialists in the medical field already, like nurses or RNs. Again, this range is going to depend on the gestational carrier's profile, her experience, her education, her job category, and it's going to also depend on the agency's policy regarding compensation. If you're working with an agency, each agency is known to have their own standard benefits package, and those packages vary. It depends on the agency and it can depend on the location. Now, if you followed some of my other videos, you probably remember that I said there are two types of compensation under the benefits package. So let's look at those two. They're additional compensation, and I'll call them as needed compensation. Let's look at additional compensation first. I call this additional compensation because this compensation is given to surrogates in addition to the base compensation that we talked about earlier. Think about it like this. The base compensation is what you could think of as pregnancy payments. So that payment isn't given out or earned until we can confirm and prove by heartbeat ultrasound that the surrogate is pregnant. That begins the clock ticking for those base compensation payments. These other additional payments are outside of the pregnancy payments themselves. I'll explain and you'll understand a little bit more. One category of additional compensation is lost wages. So for gestational carriers, each time she's needed to take time off of work to attend to doctor's appointments, or starting around the birth of the child and during the recovery time, she'll have to be off work. So we want to make sure that if she is either taken off work for doctor's appointments or maybe even put on bed rest or limited activity and not allowed to work, she would typically be reimbursed for the amount of compensation she doesn't get to earn because she's being your surrogate. A lot of times there's also lost wages for the husband or the partner of the gestational carrier if he has to take off time from work to accompany the gestational carrier either to the transfer or to doctor's appointments, or especially around the time of delivery and helping her get to the hospital and get from the hospital after the birth. Another category of additional compensation are travel allowances, and this typically applies for long distance travel. Most of the times this is something over 50 miles from her home. Anything over that is typically considered long distance, and she'll be compensated or given a per diem for food, and also her travel should be paid for, like flights or mileage over those 50 miles. If it's an overnight trip, then one would expect for her hotel or living accommodations to be covered as well. There's also additional compensation for medical procedures. Think about the embryo transfer. Typically, a surrogate will get compensation for what she endures during the embryo transfer. Also, when she starts her medications, most times surrogates are going to be taking injectable medications, which are a bit uncomfortable, and there's some compensation for that. Because remember, her base pay does not start until we prove she's pregnant. And of course, when she starts taking the medications, she's not pregnant. So she's not even getting those payments yet. So there's typically something separate for the transfer and for the start of medical injections. There's also typically a maternity clothing allowance that she gets. Of course, one of the things that comes with being pregnant is you grow a little bit, right? So you outgrow some of your clothes, and to offset the cost that it takes to get new clothes, many times a surrogate's benefits package will allow for a certain amount of money at a certain point in the pregnancy when she's probably outgrowing those clothes to have a small budget to get some more clothes for herself. We have to also think about housekeeping and childcare. Now, this typically falls under two categories. The first is if the doctor feels like the surrogate needs to be placed on bed rest or restricted activity, that means she probably won't be able to tend to her house or even tend to her children. So what is required most times is an allowance for housekeeping assistance and childcare because she's bedridden at that point and can't cover those things on her own. The second category is even if she's not on bed rest or restricted activity, a lot of agencies say, listen, in that third trimester, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get around. And so we want to give her some type of compensation for help with housekeeping and childcare, even though it's not as much as she may get if she were on complete bed rest. It's something to help her offset the cost and the inconvenience of being 8 months pregnant and having to chase around children of her own and tend to her own house. There's also the additional compensation of a monthly allowance. Now, this monthly allowance is typically non-accountable. She doesn't have to prove what she spent the money on, but it's supposed to be for a certain set of incidentals, like the mileage that she's going to have to drive within her living radius, so to speak, inside that 50-mile radius, prenatal vitamins, trips to the pharmacy, faxing things to her attorney, notarizing the contract, all of the little incidentals that come with being a surrogate, these things would be covered by the monthly allowance that she gets. There's also the potential cost of health insurance. If your surrogate doesn't already have health insurance coverage that covers her during a surrogacy pregnancy, then you may have to obtain a policy for her through the agency so that she'll be covered. Now, this is a benefit to you also because, of course, any health insurance policy that she has that covers the pregnancy offsets the amount of medical expenses that you'll have to pay for her. And the last issue I'll discuss under additional compensation is the legal fees. Each of you will have to have your own separate attorney, and it's customary for the intended parents to pay for the gestational carrier's attorney fees during the contract negotiating period and during the period to establish your parental rights. An attorney is needed at both stages and is going to fall on the parents to cover that cost for the surrogate. I've never met a surrogate who said, hey, I'll carry your baby and I'll pay for all the legal fees too. Don't worry about it. So just be prepared for that. The last category of expenses that we'll talk about are as needed compensation, as I like to call it. But before we do, here's something I want you to do. If this is making sense to you, comment below and let me know, I get it, or what else, or is this fee valid? You may have a question about a fee that you've heard of and you want to know, is it valid? Leave me a comment and I'll let you know whether I think it's valid or not. Hey, while you're around that comment block down there, go ahead and subscribe. Hit the like button. Yeah, go ahead, smash that thumbs up. Let me know that you like it and let YouTube know you like it so that they might share it with some other people. All right, let's talk about that last category, as needed compensation. Now, the as needed compensation category consists of a group of things that I tell my surrogate clients, I hope you don't get this money. All money isn't good money, and these are payments that I hope that you don't get. Let's look at a few of them. The first as needed compensation category I'll talk about are cancellation fees. Now, the cancellation fee applies if you decide to change your mind and not move forward with the surrogacy arrangement after the surrogate has began to inject herself with medication. There's also a fee associated with a mock cycle. Sometimes the doctor will say, before we move forward with a full-on surrogacy, I want to do a mock cycle with the surrogate and see how her body responds to the medical regimen or the medicine regimen, and to see whether it looks like she will be prepared and ready to be a surrogate when the time for a transfer arrives. Sort of like a trial run. The next category of as needed compensation is the multiple pregnancy additional fee. Now, typically, a multiple pregnancy is more risky than a singleton pregnancy. So that comes with an additional amount of compensation to the surrogate for taking on that added risk. So keep in mind that it may be a little more expensive if your surrogate is carrying multiples. That's twins or anything above that. Hopefully she won't be carrying anything more than twins, but just be prepared for that. There's also the idea of a cesarean section fee. Of course, a C-section is a major surgery. And so if your surrogate has to undergo that type of major surgery on your behalf to give birth to your child, there's an additional compensation that typically comes with that. There's also compensation that typically comes with invasive procedures. So make sure you keep in mind if your surrogate has to do any kind of amniocentesis, or if there is, God forbid, a miscarriage and she has to do a D&C or D&E process, any of these invasive procedures are going to come with its own set of additional compensation rules. Also, something to keep in mind, and this is something that I hope we never see, is a partial or full loss of reproductive organs. If for any reason your surrogate, because she went through this process, loses her ability to reproduce, she loses an ovary or a fallopian tube or anything like that, there's typically going to be something in the benefits package that allows her some additional compensation to just cover that. The last two things are things that aren't necessarily typical, but I see them becoming more and more frequently placed in compensation packages. And that's psychological support and organic or specific dietary concerns. So I see intended parents saying, we want to make sure that she has the access to counseling throughout the process so that she can stay balanced both mentally and psychologically. And we also want to make sure she's eating a certain way, whether that be organic or whether that be a specific type of diet that the intended parent thinks is beneficial for the pregnancy. And of course, these things are going to come with their own compensation amounts. So as you see, how much it costs to have a surrogate can depend on a number of factors. Some of these factors will be in play whether it's an independent match or whether it's a match that's moving forward with an agency attached to it. Either way, this gives you an idea of what you can expect or what you should be expecting once you go into your surrogacy arrangement. If you're looking for more tips on how to navigate the surrogacy process, I have a treat for you. It's free and it's called the Surrogacy Roadmap. You can click the link below and you'll be taken to the surrogacyroadmap.com, where you can get your hands on a graphic that will walk you through each step of the surrogacy process from beginning to end, and I even give you a video explanation of each of the steps. If you want to get your hands on that, just click the link below in the description box and I'll see you on the roadmap.